Welcome to this introductory video on debt management. In this video, we are going to cover mostly the deficit and debt, as well as bonds. Now, debt deficit occurs if your expenditures in a given time period exceed your revenues. So, for example, in a particular month or in a given month, when you are spending more than you are making in terms of wages, and you do not have any savings. For example, you are using your credit card, then you are incurring a deficit. Now, if you are doing this for multiple periods, then the accumulation of such deficits is resulting in debt. Debt is basically money or funds that are owned by someone else. Debt occurs at the federal, the state, and the local level, but of course also at the household and the firm level. So you know that there is, for example, the federal debt, but of course at the household level there could also be credit card debt or mortgages, and at the firm level or for a private industry there could be corporate bonds in order to do investments. Government debt is usually the result of covering deficits or financing capital projects, which we have talked about in previous videos. There could also be the situation where debt occurs because expenditures in the short run are higher than revenue. Now, there's a difference between the federal debt as well as the state and local debt. So the reason that there is debt at the federal level could be not only because of deficits, but there is also the stabilization purpose of the economy, or the purpose to stabilize the economy. And we have talked about this in the first lecture when we talked about the role of government in the economy. So for example, if you have a recession or if you have a pandemic like COVID-19 and the government is going to spend stimulus money, then one reason or one result of spending that money or stabilizing the economy could be the accumulation of debt. At the state and the local level, debt is usually the result of financing long-term capital projects. And we have talked about those capital projects also in previous videos. Now, there's the so-called debt held by the public in the sense of who actually owns the debt that the federal government has accumulated over the years. Note that the debt can be held by individuals, by corporations, by state and local governments, as well as the Federal Reserve System. But of course, the US debt could also be held by foreign governments or other entities outside of the United States. Now here in this picture, you see the evolution of the federal debt as a percentage of GDP. Note that about 30 years ago, when the European Union was implementing the common currency, the euro, that there was the requirement by countries to keep their debt below 60%. Okay? At the time, this was assumed to be a reasonable level. So this is only something to keep the numbers that you are seeing here in context. So you see that up until about 1990, that the federal debt was below 60% of the GDP, and that since then it has continuously increased. And here, of course, you see the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Debt is usually expressed as a percent of GDP because it puts the debt in comparison to the economic performance or the income of the country. We talked about the difference between debt, which is a stock variable, and then we also have the deficit, which is a flow variable. And here you can see the federal surplus or deficit as a percent of GDP over the recent decades. And you see that in the past, only the late 90s and beginning of 2000, we actually had a budget surplus. And all the remaining years were characterized by a deficit. A note here, you can see that since 2000s that there is a general downward trend in deficit, or not a downward trend in terms of deficit, but that the deficit gets larger and larger compared to the GDP. Now, debt can be highly problematic because it violates fiscal sustainability standards, and it also transfers the cost of consuming today to future generations. There are also other issues. For example, it restricts the ability to provide government services in the future, given that if you have more debt, your interest payments are actually going to be higher. And hence, part of the money that could, or funds that could go to providing goods and services by the government actually are transferred to pay for the interest. If you have high debt, it also restricts your ability to respond to problems through deficit financing. So for example, if you have a high debt and then there's suddenly a financial crisis, then your ability to actually respond to that financial crisis may be hindered by the fact that you already have a high debt. And hence, if you have a high debt, then financial markets may also demand higher interest rates, which then further increases your interest payments in the future. And of course, you also transfer the cost associated with the debt to future generations. Debt can also restrict your economic growth potential in the sense that when you have a higher deficit, you need to borrow more and you also have to pay potentially higher interest rates on debt. If you're paying higher interest rates, if the government pays higher interest rates on debt, that may also crowd out private capital that results in lower investment and hence in lower growth in the future. There's also the issue that debt held by foreigners or by foreign governments, that you have the servicing of the debt resulting in the leakage of money from the economy. Now, there are various methods to reduce the deficit and the debt, and of course both of those methods are very unpopular. If you're thinking about the first one, which is basically the increasing the tax revenues, either by higher rates or by a broader tax base. Now, of course, politically this is very unpopular. But so is the second method, which is basically lowering current expenditures. That also means that fewer services and goods are provided. Now on this slide, what you see as well are two quotes from the US Department of Treasury with regard to the debt limit. Basically the debt limit, and this is an item that has been in the news in recent years. A debt limit is basically setting an upper ceiling of debt that can be incurred by the government. In recent years, the ceiling has been increased continuously, and the fear is that if you fail to increase the debt limit, that it would have catastrophic economic consequences. And those are the words by the US Department of Treasuries, because it would basically cause the US government to default on its obligation to pay the debt. Now, the question is, how do governments incur debt? And here we are going to introduce bonds. A bond is basically the obligation to pay a specific sum of money at a specific date or dates in the future, together with interest payments, either annually or semi-annually, or usually annually and semi-annual, at a specific rate. And that rate is called the coupon rate. Bonds, there are two types of bonds. We have general obligation bonds, and we also have revenue bonds or non-guaranteed bonds. Now, general obligation bonds basically mean that the collateral for the principal, so that is the sum of money that is borrowed, and the interest payments is all the available tax revenue and also the taxing authority of the government entity that is issuing the bonds. Those bonds are very common for non-revenue generating projects, and the interest payments to bondholders are exempt from the federal tax. Usually there is low interest or there is low risk because there is also this results in lower interest rates, and those bonds are therefore cheaper. The low risk is due to the fact that the collateral is the tax revenue and also the taxing authority of the issuer. Usually, those general obligation bonds, they require voter approval to ensure that the voters are actually approving of the projects that are associated with the bonds. Bonds can only be issued if the government has not exceeded its statutory debt limits, and those debt limits, there are various measures for it. You can think about, for example, if you have a municipal bond or a bond for a city, then the total debt would be as a percentage of assessed property values. You could also think that the debt service should be within certain bounds as a percentage in terms of revenues. On the other hand, you have revenue, so-called revenue bonds or non-guaranteed bonds, and those are usually issued by government-owned enterprise units such as water, sewer, or electric utilities. Or they could also be issued by private entities that have public purpose, such as a hospital or a museum. Those revenue bonds are usually issued for revenue generating projects. You can think here, for example, about a bridge or a tunnel that is collecting tolls. Revenue bonds are not subject to debt limitations, and there's also the interest payments are not exempt from federal taxes. Because revenue bonds are exposed to a higher risk, because it's basically the revenue generated from the project, there's a higher risk, and hence also the interest payments on those bonds are higher. The only collateral for revenue bonds are basically the revenue generated by the project. The advantage of those revenue bonds are also that they are exempt from the debt limit, and there is no effect on the government's credit rating, and they also do not require voter approval. So this is the video that is just a very short introduction to deficit and debt as well as bonds.